If someone had told me 10 years ago that my friendship with Julian would end up here in the quiet blue light of dawn, with his arm thrown over my waist and the sound of his breathing the only thing in the universe, I would have laughed. Not a happy laugh. A sharp, bitter thing, the kind you use to protect a wound. Because for 10 years, Julian was a son I orbited at a safe, immutable distance, and getting any closer felt like a fantasy reserved for someone braver, someone better, someone who was not me. My life, before him, was a meticulously curated collection of quiet moments. It was the specific weight of my favorite ceramic mug in my hands, the smell of old paper and brewing tea that clung to my small apartment, the predictable rhythm of my freelance design work. I had built a fortress of solitude, not out of misanthropy, but out of fear. A fear so old and ingrained I barely recognized it as anything other than my own personality. I was Leo, the quiet one, the reliable one, the one who kept himself. And then there was Julian. He was not quiet. He was the loud, unapologetic clang of a hammer on steel, the scent of sawdust and summer sweat, the easy laugh that could fill a room and leave no space for silence. We met in college, a random pairing in a brutalist dorm building, and our friendship was an anomaly everyone, including myself, struggled to understand. He was motion and I was stillness. He was a bonfire and I was the cool shadow it cast. For a decade, this was our dynamic. He would crash in my life once or twice a week, bringing the chaos of the outside world with him. He'd sprawl on my sofa, all long limbs and restless energy, and tell me about his carpentry projects, about impossible clients, about the succession of women who drifted in and out of his life like seasons. I would listen, a placid island in his churning sea, and offer quiet advice. I was his anchor, his best friend. The words were a brand on my heart. Best friend. It was a label that felt both like a gift and a cage. It gave me access to his world, to the unguarded moments no one else saw. But it also drew a line, thick and permanent, a boundary I was terrified to even approach, let alone cross. So I watched from my side of it. I watched the way his eyes crinkled when he truly smiled, a fan of tiny lines that betrayed a weariness he never spoke of. I watched the casual grace in his hands, hands that could be so strong and sure with a piece of wood, yet so gentle when he'd fix a loose hinge on my kitchen cabinet without me even asking. Loving him was a silent, secret ache. It was a low-grade fever that never broke. It lived in the space between our shoulders when we sat on the couch, a humming, electric field of possibility that I was sure only I could feel. It was the reason my routines were so important. They were the walls of my fortress, and they kept the hope, the wild and dangerous hope, from spilling out and ruining everything. The disruption, when it came, was not a gentle tremor. It was a tectonic shift. It arrived in the form of a frantic phone call on a Tuesday night, a night usually reserved for my strictest work deadline. "Lau, it's me. Look, you're not going to believe this." Julian's voice was frayed, stretched thin over the line, laced with a static of pure panic. Behind him, I could hear, shouting, the unmistakable wail of a siren. "What is it? Are you okay?" My heart had already launched itself into my throat, a frantic, trapped bird. "I'm fine. Mostly. The apartment above mine, the water heater, basically exploded. My entire place is flooded. It's a disaster, Leo. The ceiling came down in the kitchen. It's ruined." I stood up, the design I was working on completely forgotten. My carefully ordered world tilted on its axis. "Where are you? Are you on the street?" "Yeah. They're shutting the whole building down for a while. Emergency repairs. Structural damage. I don't know where to go." The hesitation in his voice was so unlike him. Julian always had a plan. He was the one who solved problems, who bulldozed through obstacles. To hear him sound so lost, so adrift, was jarring. And in that moment, a single, terrifying, inevitable thought surfaced. "Come here," I said, the words leaving my mouth before my fear could veto them. "Just come here." Julian, a beat of silence. Then a sigh of such profound relief it felt like a physical weight lifting off the phone line. "Are you sure?" I don't want to impose. I'll have my truck, some tools. Don't be an idiot. Just get here. And so, the fortress was breached. Not by an invading army, but by a refugee. My refugee. He arrived an hour later, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him, his usual vibrant energy dampened, his clothes smelling of wet plaster and distress. He carried a single duffel bag and a toolbox, his face pale under the harsh yellow light of my hallway. The carefully constructed distance between us, the miles of unspoken things I kept neatly folded between us, collapsed into the few feet of my apartment entryway. He was here, in my space, and I had no idea how my quiet, ordered heart was supposed to survive it. The first 24 hours were an exercise in excruciating awareness. My apartment, which had always felt like a perfectly sized shell for one, suddenly seemed microscopic. It was a stage built for a solo performance, now inexplicably crowded with a second actor who didn't know his lines. Every surface he touched, every space he occupied, became hypervisible. His boots by the door, large, scuffed, caked with mud, and a testament to a life lived outside. They looked enormous next to my simple sneakers. An invasion. His jacket, a heavy canvas thing that smelled of pine and cold air, thrown over the back of my dining chair. It dwarfed the delicate wooden frame. My chair suddenly looked fragile, breakable. His presence was a low hum that vibrated through the floorboards. I was used to silence, to controlling the soundscape of my life with a carefully curated playlist or the gentle tap of my own keyboard. Now, there was the sound of his sigh from the living room, the rustle of him shifting on the air mattress I'd set up, the clink of a glass as he got water in the middle of the night. My home was no longer just mine. It was terrifying. It was thrilling. My stomach was a hive of nervous bees. "I can't thank you enough, man," he said the first morning, standing awkwardly in my small kitchen as I went through the sacred ritual of making coffee. I was in a real bind. "It's nothing." I managed, my voice sounding tight. I focused on the pour-over, the steady stream of hot water, the familiar bloom of the coffee grounds. A routine. An anchor in the storm that was Julian standing 3 feet away, shirtless, wearing only a pair of gray sweatpants slung low on his hips. My eye snagged on the landscape of his back, the smooth plane of it, the subtle shift of muscle as he stretched. I had seen him shirtless 100 times, at the lake after a run, but here, in the intimate context of my kitchen, it felt different. Forbidden. It felt like reading a page from a diary not meant for me. He turned, and I snapped my gaze back to the coffee, a hot flush creeping up my neck. "Smells amazing," he said, oblivious. He leaned against the counter, his proximity sending a jolt through my system. I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. I could see the faint constellation of freckles across his shoulders, the small, puckered white scar just above his left eyebrow I'd somehow never noticed in 10 years. How had I never noticed that? It was a tiny flaw in his otherwise perfect facade of strength, a little mark of vulnerability. It made him seem suddenly, startlingly real. Not the idea of Julian I had polished to a high sheen in my mind, but the man himself. Tired, stressed, human. "It's just coffee," I mumbled, pouring a cup and pushing it toward him, careful not to let our fingers touch. The days settled into a strange new rhythm. He would leave early for work, the sound of his truck rumbling to life in the street below a new, jarring alarm clock. The apartment would return to its familiar silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was an absence, a space that was waiting to be filled again. I would work, but my focus was fractured, my thoughts constantly drifting to him, wondering what he was doing, wondering when he would be back. He would return in the evening, bone-weary and frustrated, covered in a fine layer of sawdust. He spent his days on the phone with insurance adjusters and contractors, his evenings describing the bureaucratic nightmare to me over takeout containers spread across my coffee table. "They're saying it could be weeks, Leo. Maybe a month. A whole month." He dragged a hand through his hair, a gesture of pure exhaustion. "I feel like I'm losing my mind. You can stay as long as you need," I heard myself say, the words both a comfort to him and a sentence for myself. A month of this. A month of this sweet, agonizing torture. One evening, He came home with a deep, angry-looking splinter in the palm of his hand. He'd been trying to get it out himself, but had only made it worse. "It's nothing," he grumbled, trying to dismiss it, but I saw the way he winced when he tried to close his fist. "Sit down," I ordered, my voice firmer than I intended. He looked surprised, but he obeyed, sinking onto the edge of the sofa. My heart hammered against my ribs as I retrieved my first aid kit. I knelt in front of him, taking his hand in mine. This was it. The first touch. Not accidental, not a fleeting brush in a hallway, but a deliberate act. His hand was large, warm, the palm a roadmap of calluses and faint scars. It was a hand that built things, that created, that was so fundamentally capable. And it was resting in my own, which suddenly felt small and pale and useless. "Hold still," I whispered, more to myself than to him. The world narrowed to the small space of his palm. I could feel his pulse, a steady, thrumming beat beneath his skin. Or maybe it was my own, echoing up through my fingertips. I cleaned the area carefully, my movements precise, my breath held tight in my chest. He was so still, so quiet. I could feel his eyes on me, a heavy, unreadable gaze. I took the tweezers. "This might hurt. I'll live," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. I focused, gently probing the angry red skin. He didn't flinch. He just watched me, his expression something I couldn't decipher. It wasn't just tolerance. It was something else, something softer, an unguardedness I'd never seen before. In that moment, the dynamic between us shifted. I wasn't the quiet, passive observer. I was the one with the steady hand. I was the one providing care. For the first time, I felt like his equal, not his satellite. I finally gripped the end of the splinter and pulled. It came free, a long, dark sliver of wood. He let out a slow breath he'd clearly been holding. "There," I said, my voice shaky with the aftermath of the adrenaline. I cleaned the tiny wound and pressed a bandage over it. My fingers lingered on his palm for a fraction of a second too long. A spark, a definite, undeniable spark. I pulled my hand away as if burned. "Thanks, Leo," he said, his voice quiet. He was still looking at me with that same strange intensity. "You're good at that. I have a steady hand." I stood up, needing to put distance between us, to break the spell. "It's from all the detail work on the computer." He flexed his bandaged hand, a small, thoughtful smile playing on his lips. "Right. The computer," he didn't say anything else, but the air in the room had changed. The unspoken thing between us had woken up. It was no longer dormant. It was breathing, and we were both pretending we couldn't hear it. The storm broke on a Friday night, a week after he'd moved in. It wasn't a meteorological storm, but an emotional one, brewed in the close, charged confines of my apartment. Rain lashed against the windows, a dramatic soundtrack to the tension that had been building between us. We were on the couch, a safe foot of space between us, pretending to watch some mindless action movie on television. But I wasn't watching the screen. I was watching the flicker of the city lights reflect in Julian's eyes. I was watching the way he chewed on his lower lip, a nervous habit I knew meant his mind was miles away. The silence in the room was a physical weight, heavier than the sound of the rain and the movie's explosions combined. He finally broke it. He muted the television, plunging the room into a sudden, shocking quiet. "I can't do this," he said, his voice raw. My blood ran cold. This. He meant this. Living here. He was leaving. The thought was a punch to the gut. "You can't do what?" "If it's too much, if I'm in your way." He turned to face me fully, the space between us shrinking. His eyes were dark, turbulent. "No, Leo. Not that. This." He gestured vaguely between the two of us. This pretending, my heart stopped. Pretending. Or were we pretending? I was pretending I wasn't in love with him. What was he pretending? "I don't know what you mean." I whisper, my throat tight. "Don't you?" He let out a harsh, frustrated sound. "I feel more at home here, on your lumpy air mattress, than I have in my own place for years. I don't know." He looked down at his hands, at the small white bandage I placed there days ago. "I spend all day fighting with people on the phone, dealing with this mess, and the only thing that gets me through it is knowing I'm coming back here." He looked up, and his gaze was so direct, so vulnerable, it stole the air from my lungs. I'm coming back to you, the words hung in the air. A confession, not of love, not yet, but of something just as powerful, of need, of belonging. And in his eyes, I saw a decade of my own secret longing reflected back at me. The fortress walls I had so carefully maintained crumbled into dust. All the fear, all the careful reservations, they were meaningless in the face of this. This was the moment. The precipice. I could step back, make a joke, pretend he meant nothing by it, and preserve the fragile safety of our friendship. Or I could jump. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, a wild, chaotic rhythm. The blood roared in my ears. I could feel the tremor in my own hands. For 10 years, I had chosen safety. I had chosen the quiet ache of longing over the potential devastation of rejection. But looking at him now, seeing the fear and hope warring in his face, I knew I couldn't choose safety anymore. Julian, I started, my voice barely a croak. For me, it's always been here. It's always been you. The admission felt like tearing a part of myself open for him to see. It was the most terrifying thing I had ever done. His expression shifted. The turbulence in his eyes stilled, replaced by a dawning, incredulous wonder. He searched my face, looking for the punchline, for the escape clause. He found none. He only found the truth, bare and unprotected. Leo, he breathed my name like a question, a prayer, and then he was moving. He closed the small distance between us, his movements slow, hesitant, as if he were approaching a frightened animal. He raised a hand, not to his own face, but to mine. His calloused fingertips, so impossibly gentle, brushed against my cheek. The touch was electric, a shock that jolted through every nerve in my body. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. His eyes asked the question, and I answered by leaning into his touch, by closing my eyes. The first kiss wasn't a collision. It was a discovery. His lips were soft, questioning. It was hesitant and unsure, a conversation without words. It tasted of rain and salt and 10 years of unspoken things. It was a question and a confession and an apology all at once. There was none of the frantic passion I had imagined in my loneliest daydreams. This was something quieter, deeper, more honest. It was a slow, careful exploration of a new world we had just discovered together. His hand moved from my cheek to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, holding me there, grounding me. My own hands, seeming to have a will of their own, came up to rest on his chest, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart beneath my palms. It was racing just as fast as mine. He wasn't the confident, untouchable sun god of my imagination. He was just Julian, and he was just as scared and hopeful as I was. When we finally broke apart, we just looked at each other, our foreheads resting together. The air was thick with the unsaid, but it was a comfortable weight now, not a tense one. It was the weight of revelation. Oh, was all he said, a soft puff of air. It was a sound of realization, of a puzzle piece clicking into place. Yeah, I whispered back. Oh, there were no more words after that. Not for a long time. He led me by the hand from the couch, down the short hallway to my bedroom. My room, the inner sanctum of my fortress. And it didn't feel like an invasion. It felt like a homecoming. That night, the world shrank to the size of my bed, to the shape of his body next to mine, to the feeling of his skin against my skin. It was a landscape of discovery, of quiet murmurs and gentle touches, of learning the rhythm of another person's breath as your own. It was less about passion and more about a profound, soul-deep recognition. It was the feeling of finally, after a lifetime of searching, finding a place you belonged. I fell asleep, wrapped in his arms, the sound of the rain a distant lullaby, my heart finally, blessedly quiet. The fever had broken. The ache was gone, replaced by a warmth that spread through me like sunlight. For the first time in a decade, I didn't feel like I was orbiting him. We were two celestial bodies that had finally found their proper alignment, pulled into a shared gravitational center. And it was perfect. I woke to the cold. It was the first thing I registered. Not the gray morning light filtering through my blinds, not the lingering scent of him on my pillows, but the stark, empty cold of the space beside me. My eyes snapped open. The other side of the bed was empty. The sheets were cool to the touch, the indentation of his body already fading. Panic, cold and sharp, seized me, a snake uncoiling in my stomach. No! I sat up, my heart beginning a frantic, panic tattoo against my ribs. The apartment was silent. Too silent. The comforting hum of his presence was gone. I threw my legs over the side of the bed and walked into the living room. The air mattress was still there, deflated and sad. His duffel bag was gone. His boots were gone from their spot by the door. My eyes scanned the room, desperate for any sign. And then I saw it. A single piece of paper, a folded note on the kitchen counter, weighted down by a salt shaker. My hands trembled as I picked it up. My name, Leo, was scrawled on the front in his familiar, slightly messy handwriting. I unfolded it. The words inside were few, and they were a knife to the heart. Had to go to work early. See you, that was it. Not last night. Was amazing, not we need to talk, not even a simple thanks, just see you clinical. Distant. The kind of note you'd leave for a roommate. The snake of panic in my stomach began to constrict, squeezing the air from my lungs. The warmth of the previous night evaporated, replaced by an icy dread. It was a mistake. The thought slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. Of course it was. He was vulnerable. His life was in chaos. He was feeling grateful. And I had taken advantage of it. I had projected my decade of longing onto a moment of weakness, and he was too kind, too decent to push me away in a moment. But the morning had brought clarity. Regret. I sank onto a kitchen chair, the note still clutched in my hand, the paper crinkling under the pressure. My mind became a torture chamber, replaying every moment from the night before. But this time, the footage was twisted, distorted by my fear. His hesitation before the kiss wasn't uncertainty, it was reluctance. His gentleness wasn't tenderness, it was him trying not to hurt my feelings. His quietness afterwards wasn't contentment, it was shock. How could I have been so stupid? So utterly, blindingly stupid? I had taken our friendship, the most precious thing in my life, this beautiful, stable 10-year constant, and I had shattered it. For what? For one night. One night of living a fantasy that was never meant to be real. The silence of the apartment was deafening now. It was no longer a peaceful solitude. It was a roaring, empty void where he was supposed to be. Every object mocked me. The coffee mug he'd used. The indentation on the sofa cushion where he'd sat. The small, white bandage I found in the trash can. I spent the day in a fugue state of anxiety. I tried to work, but the lines on my screen blurred into meaningless shapes. I stared at my phone, willing it to ring, to buzz with a text from him. A text that would explain everything. An apology. A clarification. Anything. But the phone remained silent. Dark. Accusatory. Each passing hour was another turn of the screw. With every tick of the clock, my conviction grew. He was figuring out how to let me down easy. He was composing the let's just be friends speech. The thought of hearing those words from him, of having to go back to being his best friend after last night, was unbearable. It would be a hollow charade, a constant, painful reminder of what I had ruined. My carefully constructed fortress hadn't just been breached, it had been leveled, and I was left standing in the rubble, exposed and shivering. The solitude I had once cultivated as a source of peace now felt like a punishment. It was the silence of rejection, the emptiness of loss. By the time evening fell, I was a wreck. I had convinced myself that he wasn't coming back. He would find somewhere else to stay, a hotel, another friend's place. He would send a text, a brief, polite message thanking me for my hospitality, and then he would disappear from my life, leaving only the ghost of his presence and the gaping wound of my own foolishness. I was curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring blankly at the dark television screen when I heard it. A key in the lock. My head snapped up. My heart stopped dead in my chest. It couldn't be. He wouldn't just walk back in. Not after. The door opened, and there he was. Julian. He looked awful. Worse than I'd ever seen him. His face was pale, drawn. There were dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there yesterday. He looked like he hadn't slept. He looked like he'd been through his own private hell. He closed the door softly behind him and just stood there in the entryway, his shoulders slumped. He wasn't holding a duffel bag. He was holding a greasy bag of takeout. We stared at each other across the length of the living room. The silence was stretched so taut between us it felt like it would snap. My anxiety was a wild animal clawing at the inside of my chest, screaming at me to say something, to apologize, to fix this. But I was frozen. He was the one who moved first. He dropped the takeout bag on the small entryway table and walked toward me, his steps slow, deliberate. He didn't stop until he was standing right in front of the couch, looming over me. I had to crane my neck to look up at him. His expression was unreadable, a mask of exhaustion and something else, something that looked like fear. And then he did the last thing I expected. He didn't speak. He just sank to his knees in front of me, put his hands on my shoulders, and buried his face in my lap. I could feel the shudder that ran through his entire body. A deep, racking tremor. I was so shocked, I couldn't move. I could only feel the warmth of his head through the thin material of my sweatpants, the desperate grip of his hands on my shoulders. "Julian," I whispered, my voice trembling. He didn't lift his head. His voice was muffled, thick with an emotion I couldn't place. "I'm so sorry, Lao sorry." Sorry for what? For last night? The confirmation was a fresh wave of pain. "It's okay," I said automatically, the lie tasting like ash in my mouth. "It was a mistake. We could just forget." "No." He lifted his head, and his eyes were glistening. "Raw. Not for that. I'm sorry for today. For leaving like that. For the note. For everything." I stared at him, confused. "I don't understand." He let out a long, shaky breath and sat back on his heels, though his hands never left my knees, as if he needed the physical contact to keep himself anchored. "I woke up this morning," he began, his voice low and ragged, "and I was terrified. I was lying next to you, and it felt right. More right than anything has ever felt in my entire life. And it scared the hell out of me." He looked away at some distant point across the room. "All my life, I've known how to build things. Houses, furniture, things with plans, with right angles. Things that make sense. And last night, it doesn't have a blueprint, Leo. I don't know what I'm doing." He met my eyes again, and the vulnerability there was staggering. The strong, silent facade was completely gone. This was the real Julian. Scared, insecure, confused. "I panicked," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I just ran. I went to the work site, and I just threw myself into it, thinking if I worked hard enough, I could just, I don't know, sweat out of my system. Pretend it didn't happen. But it was all I could think about. You, us, the way you looked at me." He shook his head, a look of self-disgust on his face. "And the whole time, I was thinking about you here, alone, wondering what the hell was going on. I knew that note was a coward's move the second I wrote it. I've been a complete idiot. I hurt you, and I am so sorry." The relief that washed over me was so immense, so powerful. It made me dizzy. It was a physical sensation, like a dam breaking inside me, releasing a flood of emotion I'd been holding back all day. The anxiety, the fear, the self-recrimination, it all just washed away, leaving a trembling, fragile hope in its place. "I thought you regretted it," I whispered. A tear I hadn't realized was forming, finally escaping and tracing a hot path down my cheek. "Regret it?" He let out a sound that was halfway between a laugh and a sob. "Leo, last night was the first honest thing I think I've done in years. It's the only thing that's made sense in this whole mess." He reached up and gently wiped the tear from my cheek with his thumb. "This is new for me. This territory. It's frightening. But the only thing more frightening than this," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "is the thought of going back to the way things were before. Pretending. Lying to myself. Lying to you, me too." I breathed, the words full of a decade of silent agreement. "I'm scared too good," he said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through the strain on his face. "Then we can be scared together." That conversation was the foundation for our new world. We talked for hours sitting on the floor of my living room, the forgotten takeout growing cold on the table. We unwound 10 years of assumptions, of missed signals, of unspoken feelings. He talked about the pressure from his family to settle down, to follow a path he wasn't sure he wanted. He confessed his own loneliness, a deep and abiding thing he had hidden behind a wall of easy charm and constant motion. He admitted that his string of girlfriends was never about them, but about a desperate search for the kind of connection, the feeling of being truly seen, that he'd only ever found with me. And I talked. I told him everything. About the fear, about the longing, about how watching him from the sidelines had been both the greatest joy and the greatest pain in my life. At some point, he stood up and walked over to his jacket, which he'd hung on the door hook when he came in. He fished around in the pocket and came back with a set of keys. Not his truck keys, his apartment keys, the ones he wouldn't be needing for a month. He knelt in front of me again and held them out. I looked at them, then back at him, confused. "My landlord called today," he said quietly. "They found more damage. It's going to be longer than a month. Maybe 2. Maybe more." My heart sank a little. More chaos for him. "I don't want to go back," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "Even when it's fixed. That place, it was never a home. It was just a place I slept. He looked around my small, cluttered apartment, and my books, my art, my quiet life. "This feels like home." He pressed the keys into my palm and closed my fingers around them. The metal was cool against my skin. "I don't want to be your temporary guest, Leo," he said, his eyes boring into mine, full of a terrifying, wonderful sincerity. "I want to be here, with you, if you'll have me." It wasn't a grand, poetic declaration. It was something better. It was real. It was a tangible act, a promise, a key. It was the blueprint he had been looking for, the first step in building something new, something together. I could only nod, my throat too thick with emotion to speak. I just opened my hand and intertwined my fingers with his, the keys digging into our joined palms. A silent, perfect agreement. The next few months were a lesson in domestic intimacy. We learned to navigate the small space of my apartment, not as a host and a guest, but as partners. His things began to mingle with mine. His heavy work boots found a permanent home by the door. A second toothbrush appeared in the holder of my bathroom. A corner of my meticulously organized living room was slowly, happily colonized by a stack of his woodworking magazines and a half-finished carving of a small, intricate bird. The silence I had once cherished was replaced by a new kind of soundscape. The sound of his steady breathing next to me in bed each morning, a sound that was no longer a source of anxiety, but the deepest comfort I had ever known. The sound of his laughter as we cooked dinner together in the tiny kitchen, bumping hips and stealing bites of food. The sound of 2 lives, once parallel, finally, joyfully converging. Waking up was no longer a moment of potential panic. It was a quiet joy. Some mornings I'd wake first and just watch him sleep, watch the way the morning light traced the line of his jaw, the scar above his eyebrow. I would marvel at the simple, impossible fact that he was here. Other mornings, I'd wake to the smell of coffee already brewing, and I'd find him in the kitchen, shirtless in his sweatpants, smiling at me over the rim of a mug. "My mug." "Morning," he'd say, his voice still thick with sleep. And my heart would feel so full it was a physical pressure in my chest. A good pressure, a warmth. We were building our own blueprint day by day. It was made of small moments. Of him fixing the wobbly leg on my desk without a word. Of me learning exactly how he liked his coffee. Of quiet evenings on the couch, my legs thrown over his lap, his hand resting absently on my ankle, a constant grounding touch. My life, my old, solitary, routine-driven life was gone. I had mistaken my fortress for a home, my solitude for peace. I had thought my quiet world was complete. I was wrong. It was a waiting room. I was just waiting for him to knock on the door. Julian wasn't a disruption to my life. He was the plot twist that revealed what the story had been about all along. He didn't shatter my world. He expanded it, filled it with a light and a warmth I never knew it was missing. He showed me that the bravest thing you can ever do is to hand someone the key to your fortress and trust them to walk in. Not as a conqueror, but as a partner, ready to help you build something new, something better, something shared. And in the quiet moments, when I feel the solid weight of him next to me in the dark, I know, with a certainty that settles deep in my bones, that I am finally, truly home.